It is sitting.
And Sylvia, let me know if you can see if people are. Oh, no, I do have access to it.
Yeah, but people are all starting
Okay.
to hop on.
All right. I do see people are hopping on, so thank you to those who have already joined. I'm gonna give us a couple more minutes just so like everyone can come in. And then we can go ahead and start. Just give it one more minute. I think people will probably filter in throughout. Okay, I think we can go ahead and start. But good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to attend our webinar. And thank you to all of our panelists who also were able to make it today. My name is Hannah Dasu. I'm the Policy and Research Manager at Mgage. Mgage is a civic advocacy organization that educates and mobilizes Muslim American voters. And part of our work has included engaging with global human rights issues, including that in Burma, in Palestine, and Sudan now more recently. And this is work that we've maintained for several years now. Last year, we hosted our first ever Sudan Advocacy Week, directly connecting all of the Sudanese in the DMV and experts with over 50 congressional offices, where we successfully advocated for legislation focused on Sudan. And this year, I'm really pleased to announce that we are continuing advocacy this year, and we've managed to secure over 100 meetings on the Hill. So I can send a little bit more information towards the end of this webinar on if you're interested in volunteering. Um, so as this war in Sudan, as it reaches its 4-year mark this April, Sudan remains the largest humanitarian crisis, as well as the biggest and fastest growing displacement crisis, resulting in two-thirds of the population in need of dire and urgent humanitarian aid. And this impact on the Sudanese people is devastating. Over 15 million people have been displaced from their homes, an additional, or sorry, including 8.8 million who've been internally displaced. Over 4 million refugees have fled to neighboring countries. More than 21 million people are facing high levels of acute food insecurity, and over 150,000 Sudanese have lost their lives that we know of. So, starvation, particularly amongst children, is widespread. Women have been subjected to extreme sexual violence, whilst also being forced to become the breadwinners for their families, as Sudanese men and boys have been targeted. Both the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid supply forces are responsible for countless atrocities, war crimes, and acts that meet the definition of genocide. And so these numbers, they reflect the seriously harrowing situation that they're facing. And exacerbating this is the involvement of a number of countries, including Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Russia, and a few others who've treated Sudan as a personal playground to fight proxy wars, arming and aiding either SAF or the RSF. Mediation efforts have failed to produce any sort of results, as both the leaders of SAF and RSF have refused to halt their violence. And Darfur, in particular, has been the site of some of the worst fighting and devastation, which unfortunately has been mirroring the violence that we saw back in 2003. Al Fasher, in particular, fell to the RSF in October of last year, and according to a recent UN fact-finding mission report, they've committed genocide against mostly non-Arab ethnic groups, specifically the Zaghawa and Fur communities, making this also the fastest and largest killing spree in this century. In the Kordofan region, the RSF is attempting to secure territorial control of Darfur by capturing the Kordofan states, leading to intensified near daily drone strikes and causing mass civilian casualties, damaging essential civilian infrastructure, which has included hospitals and schools. So during this webinar, we hope to shed a bit more light on how we got to this stage in Darfur, with a particular focus on the impact of this violent conflict on both the role and the lives of Sudanese women. But I also do want to end on a hopeful note by examining what a lasting peace could look like for Sudan and its people who have been ignored for far too long. I also want to let attendees know that there is a Q&A chat box where you can type out your questions. So feel free to submit the questions throughout the session, and I'm going to do my best to get to them during our Q&A session, which will be after our moderated session. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Inas Abdullah. She is a development practitioner, feminist, and peace advocate for Nala Femme Sudan Task Force. Inas's work focuses on the gendered cost of war, women's political exclusion from peace negotiations, and the structural limitations of state-centric security approaches in protracted conflicts. Her research examines how women's roles evolve from peacetime to wartime in Sudan, particularly in Darfur. She has conducted field research on grassroots peace-building initiatives and women's participation in conflict and post-conflict settings, and has engaged with international institutions on issues of gender justice, accountability, and inclusive governance. So with that, Inas, feel free to just give your statement.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hannah. And it was a pleasure also seeing you 2 weeks ago. And I'm glad that our networking concluded to meet again in such an important and timing webinar. And it's an important conversation as well. And it's truly an honor to be part of this. So I come to this discussion with both personally and professionally as someone from Sudan, as the speakers feel the heaviness of the topic. But importantly, also like with having roots in Darfur and the reflection of how growing up, you hear the stories are folded into this massive atrocities. And as a researcher also focusing on gender conflict and peace building, my work has particularly examining the gender impact of war and the gap between women's roles in sustaining communities during conflict and their exclusion from formal peace processes. Because it was a question of how, when the states entirely collapse, who sustain lives during this, but also like how, when we see proposals for peace initiatives and either the Quad or regional peace initiatives, women are like marginally excluded from this and not mentioned even in one sentence or even just tokenistic, let's say. So it's kind of like something that needs to reflect on, because it's also make us repeat again how historical peace agreements looked like. So expecting also different results, it's kind of something naive if we did the same mistakes. So the question whether Darfur will remain also forgotten is not only about visibility anymore, it's about whose experience are also recognized and whose suffering is politically acknowledged. So what we are witnessing today in the whole Sudan and specifically in Darfur is not a new crisis, and we need to remind ourselves this, but a continuation and escalation of long-standing patterns of violence and marginalization and impunity. This is the important things, that the impunity that is sustaining this war. However, the current phase of the conflict is distance in its intensity, its fragmentation, and its direct impact on civilians, because we have evidence, we have videos, we have people that shows their face where they're killing people, but they lack the accountability side, and they know that they can do this today and tomorrow and in the future. And that's something that we need again to reflect on. So recent findings by the United Nations Facts Finding Mission for Sudan have pointed how there's a pattern of violence that may include genocidal intent, and particularly in Darfur at the same time. So the humanitarian situation continues to be intensified with widespread of displacement, collapse of essential services, with recent collapse of the education hospital, مستشفى التعليمي, and مستشفى السعودي, the Saudi hospital, and an increasing vulnerability among civilians. So from a gender perspective, the impact is particularly severe because women are disproportionately affected by displacement, as we know, sexual violence and economic collapse, while also becoming the primary providers and stabilizers, let's say, to their communities. So if Darfur is not remain forgotten, the response must be beyond humanitarian assistance at this time. It requires accountability and inclusive approaches to peace, and a fundamental shift in how we recognize and engage those most affected by the conflict. Later on, I will speak further when I give it back to you in the conversation, was also how, when I met with the State Department in my last visit to Washington, how the revealing of some facts made us rethink of the importance of engaging of civil society organization. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Inas. That was a great statement. I want to introduce our next speaker, Mutassim Ali. He is a senior legal advisor at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights and the co-author of the independent legal analysis into breaches of the Genocide Convention in Sudan and a war on children, a world complicit. His current practice focuses on international law, human rights law, and international humanitarian law. Dr. Ali is a doctor of juridical science candidate at American University Washington College of Law, and his research interests focus on peacemaking and constitution making in post-conflict states.
Thank you, Hannah, for this very kind introduction, but also timely event. Sadly, soon we'll commence the fourth year into this brutal conflict. And I think, you know, I just don't want to replicate what Ines has already talked about, but I think one thing I would like to highlight is that perhaps linking the present to the past, and then the pervasive culture of impunity that has emboldened the ongoing atrocities, and that this conflict cannot be understood in isolation from these two key parts. And then finally, I would like to speak about the current peace efforts, and then we'll take it from there. And we know that this conflict, for most part, is being framed or described as a struggle between, or power struggle between the Sudanese armed forces, the SAF, and the rapid support forces. We know that the RSF emerged from the notorious Janjaweed militia. And so this framing as the power struggle between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces conceals the deeper historical roots of the conflict. We know that from Sudan's independence in 1956, and I don't want to talk a lot about the history, but it is really critical to mention this. Sudan has been governed by a narrow elite or select few that presided over an even development and political exclusion, systematic marginalization of the country's peripheries. Southern Sudan today, we know as the independent state of South Sudan, the Nuba Mountains, the Blue Nile, Darfur, Eastern Sudan, and of course the Far East, Northern Sudan. And so throughout the history, the successive regimes, including the most recent, perhaps the Bashir regime, relied heavily on militarized repression rather than political dialogue. And in doing so, it created, or the successive regimes created, an armed constellation of militias, predominantly Arab, tasked with repressing or suppressing dissent, particularly from communities perceived as non-Arabs and non-Muslims. And therefore, people perceived as threats to the state's perceived identity as an Arab and Islamic state. The Janjaweed and later the RSF, as mentioned, were products of this architecture of state-sponsored violence. And so in 2019, Sudanese people, women, youth led historic revolution, we know, that removed Bashir, one of the Africa's longest ruling dictators. And yet the military today, the warring parties, the Sudanese armed forces and rebel support forces, remained united in violently suppressing protesters instead of holding them to account. Political elites, and here I refer to the pro-democracy leaders during the transitional period, entered into a power-sharing arrangement that entrenched military dominance and culminated in the 2021 military takeover. And it is against this backdrop that this current conflict must be understood. My second point is on the issue of impunity. We know that for more than 2 decades, despite the commission of widespread and systematic atrocities across the country, Sudan, accountability has been the exception rather than the rule. And there are only 2 cases that stand out, at least as far as I remember. One is the domestic conviction of 4 RSF soldiers for killing protesters in 2019 in Al-Obeid. These individuals who have since been released and rejoined the RSF. This is one case. The second is the conviction of Ali Muhammad Ali Abdurrahman Koshib, Ali Koshib, known as Ali Koshib, by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Darfur in 2003 and 2004. Beyond these 2 isolated instances, impunity has been near total. Extensive documentation, including, as mentioned by Inaz, the UN fact-finding mission, special procedures, and civil society groups. We know that the warring party staff and the RSF have committed mass atrocities. Sexual violence has been used as a weapon of war, starvation, and all these atrocities. The destruction of civilian infrastructure, and they often celebrated their conduct publicly with for the world to watch. And this is because the perpetrators, as Inaz mentioned, fear no accountability because they have never experienced it. And just my final point on the question of the peace process, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little more. We know that the United States is currently leading efforts through the so-called Quad, the self-appointed group, comprising of the US, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates. The real risk that this process will basically replicate the past patterns, basically. Shielding perpetrators, privileging geopolitical interests, and reducing Sudanese people to passive recipients of externally imposed solutions. We've seen that in numerous peace agreements, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement signed in 2005, the Abuja Peace Agreement. There are a bunch of agreements that I can list. And so I am really not hopeful by the efforts that the US is leading at the moment. This is because a credible peace process must be Sudanese owned. And for such a process to succeed, the international community must prioritize ending atrocities by holding perpetrators and those who enable them to account. And here, I would like to emphasize on the importance of holding the external actors, individuals, states, and corporate entities to account. This is because the power to determine Sudan's future rests with the Sudanese people, and that cannot be determined by external actors, and not by foreign governments. And nobody else can dictate the destiny of the Sudanese people. I'm going to leave it there, Hannah.
Thank you so much. I feel like that's a really good way of ending it. And I do agree. I do think that the peace process should be, completely led by the Sudanese. And with that, I want to introduce our last panelist, Haneen Ahmed. She is part of the external relations team for the Sudan Emergency Response Rooms. Haneen initiated the old Omdurman Emergency Response Room, which helps Sudanese with food supplies, medication, gender-based violence, and evacuation centers. Additionally, she founded a youth network in Sudan to serve civilians' various needs and is a member of Peace for Sudan, a women's group advocating for peace. She has served as Secretary General for the African Union Youth Assembly. She is also a member of Engaging Women in Post-Conflict Economic and Political Decision-Making by UNDP and the North African Youth Group for Peace and Security by the African Union. She also belongs to the Women Advanced Security in Sudan and presented research on women and youth political participation in Sudan at Oxford University in 2019. So, Haneen, feel free to... Oh, I think you're still on mute, though.
Okay.
Oh, yeah,
Okay,
we
is that
can...
good? Yeah, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity as an officer to, reflect the humanitarian situation on the ground. And I want to build on what my colleagues said, and also I want to add some new points on the critical humanitarian situation right now in Sudan. So ERRs is a grassroots. For those who doesn't know what ERR is Emergency Response Room is a grassroots movement leading the humanitarian aid across Sudan with 26,000 volunteers and leading more than 50 million right now on the ground across 18 states, 118 locality in Sudan. So we are covering the whole country. We were established within a day after war broke out in April 2023. It's a women and youth-led grassroots movement. So we stepped up. We didn't, stay idle by, and then we stood up and we became a first responder. So led, as I said, led by women when the formal system collapsed. Right now, there is 9.6 million begin internal displaced persons. So we remain the main dominant force in the response, particularly addressing the gender-based violence through Women Response Room. We provide protocols and everything that GBV survivor needs with emergency and first aid. Also, we have like kind of trauma healing centers for women in kind of safe spaces. We provide communal soup kitchens for people who are in survivors. And this is across Sudan, not only in Darfur. And right now we are being seen people fled from Darfur to Chad, from Darfur to northern states in El Dabba, in Red Sea states, and also in eastern states. So people are fled across Sudan, and I think we can say the best address for this webinar is, will Sudan be forgotten? Because right now the conflict is escalating in Kordofan area, and people of Kordofan, they are facing the same genocide that colleagues in Al-Fashir faced in emergency response room. We have been lost more than 150 volunteers, and we don't know if they are still alive or not, unfortunately. So after everyone know, we are all watching that after the siege of Al-Fashir is being taken over by the RSF, and as my colleague Inas mentioned, that the UN fact-finding mission has now consulted that RSF committed genocide against Eastern Arab and for Zagawa and for communities. So they are being doing the same thing in Kordofan, but with camera off. Unfortunately, as emergency response room, we are being reached out to one of the missions in the Security Council during that massacres, and they held urgent session within the council, and then after we didn't see anything, just the same genocide and the same thing, but the without open cameras. Moreover, I want to add that not only Sudanese women are suffering inside Sudan, in Khartoum, Al Jazeera, Kordofan, Darfur, or everywhere, but they are also being suffering when they fled out from Sudan to neighboring hood countries like Chad, Egypt, Kampala. I was in the region 3 months ago, and I have been watched this how women facing another awful war more than there was in Sudan, because of no some of the countries are not and preventing refugees from work. The role of the UNHCR, it's too weak, and even the external actors are not paying attention to Sudanese civilians who are fled from the war or are even facing war inside Sudan. For the role of the external and the regional dynamics. So I remember that the US recruited, or the US Congress recruited a special envoy for Sudan. He has been supportive for the grassroots movement and civilians transition, but unfortunately, we didn't see anything after the political context changed. And I want to also stress that Muhtasim point of the external actors should rely on the Sudanese solution coming from inside. We don't want any kind of solution because we are being seen the result of the external solution. And in my point of view, it's excluded, as Ina said, it's excluded women, it's excluded civilians, grassroots, real civilians people. So it's been like headhunting for relation. There is no mass consultation for this kind of solutions, and I think I don't think so. This a right pathway to move on from what we are facing, and also from the gender lens and dynamics that conflict is being impacted the socio-economic roles of the women themselves, from being caregiver to first responders, and some of them they carried weapons from the RSF as well. As at the end of the day, they used to be civilians, but they are get affected by the situation of the war itself. So, and they are also being faced a lot of gender-based violence. So I think we are being documented more than 4,000 gender-based violence case. They are seeking seeking treatment and trauma healing between beginning of 2024 to end of the 2025, and we are still receiving those kind of GBV survivors. For the peace processes, so as Muhtasem said, so I don't want to add more about that. We need to stress, and we need to encourage international community. They need to encourage the national solution by Sudanese themselves, and they need to stop bad intervention from the other external actors that harm the Sudanese communities, that harm the Sudanese. They are also, they harm the Sudanese unity, and they are highly caused a real fragmentation within the Sudanese body. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Haneen. And thank you for really speaking a bit more about what you've been seeing on the ground. I feel like that's always such a helpful perspective to get. We don't hear so much about that. I do want to go into our moderated session, and I know quite a few of you, or all of our panelists, did touch on some of the topics I really wanted to cover, but I was hoping we can go a little bit more in depth. And one of the themes that I noticed with all of your statements is this idea of accountability. I mean, Matasam, you had mentioned the culture of impunity that has really proliferated as a result of the lack of accountability that we're seeing. And I think this was also mentioned with the fact-finding mission's recent report. They did highlight that the actions that were taken by the RSF, they're indicators of genocidal intent. So considering that accountability of perpetrators remains imperative, what specific legal mechanisms, whether it's ad hoc tribunals or ICC referrals, what would be the most viable for achieving justice for these crimes? And what evidence preservation efforts do you think are still necessary? And I'm going to open it up to everyone.
Absolutely. I can begin. So first of all, I think um, the dilemma that we're facing is really less legal and even lesser about evidence, because there's like a lot of evidence out there implicating the perpetrators, right? This is not I mean, in fact, the perpetrators themselves document the atrocities, they brag about it, right? They glorify the atrocities. We've seen that. Um, um, in fact, when you speak about the genocide and all of these atrocities we see today, many of us saw them coming, right? We actually in 2023 we warned the international community in a letter signed by over 100 international jurists and prosecutors and just practitioners, saying that the population in Al-Fajr, this was actually after the massacre in Al Junayn in 2023, and in that letter basically we said the population in and around Al-Fajr were facing serious risk of genocide. This was 2 years prior to the atrocities in Al-Fashir. The idea was to trigger the international duty to prevent. It was preventable, but nothing happened. In terms of legal mechanism, for sure, of course, as I mentioned, really we have legal regimes in place. We have the universal jurisdiction, we have the even domestic legal regimes to hold the individuals and even corporate entities to account. But we also feel it is really important to cut off the perpetrators from the funding sources to fund so that allow them to continue the atrocities, and that begins by going after the states that are, fueling the atrocities. There are many of them, including many of the Sudan's neighboring countries, that are allowing, the perpetrators uh, to sift supplies, military supplies, and funds, and everything that they need to continue the atrocities. And so, unless you target those states, I think we'll continue to see the atrocities. And because of that, we believe in having something really major against the states, right, before the International Court of Justice, the Court of States, to hold countries, right, for breaches of international conventions, such as the Genocide Convention, such as the Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and other sort of human rights treaties. Regrettably, with all these legal regimes and all the evidence that we have, the issue is really the political will. And so, in the absence of political will, none of this would be possible. Unfortunately, from our engagements with many actors with influence, there seems to be total reluctance from calling out some of the facilitators and enablers of the atrocities, namely the United Arab Emirates, one of them. And so, I mean, of course, I'm naming the UAE because it's like a principal back of the RSF. We know that for sure, but there are additional states that are also backing the warring parties. But I think the UAE enjoys the most scrutiny. Hard to criticize the UAE. It's easy to say, Qatar or Turkey or Egypt, Saudi Arabia backing the Sudanese armed forces, but once you call out the UAE, immediately you will hear the backlash on why we only singling out the UAE. And sometimes, as the Sudanese, will be flagged as, you know, uh, affiliate as a Muslim Brotherhood, affiliate. This is a defensive way to basically shield and protect the UAE from scrutiny. And so, to your question, Hannah, once again, um, you know, uh, there are numerous mechanisms. I mean, international, regional, and domestic regimes that could hold perpetrators accountable. We know that many of the perpetrators are still in, for example, in Nairobi, in Kampala, and other places. But you really need political will to do so, and that political will does not exist at this point in time.
Feel free to chime in, Haneen and Inas.
I just also want to talk about like to emphasize on Matasem's point, but also like the growing role of drone warfare. It's also very important because from April 2023 until January 2026, 1,300 drone strikes recorded across Sudan. And this can show you the amount of the proxy war that is now being sustained. So discussing also humanitarian side won't be necessary as much as how if this war is stopped, how Sudanese people themselves can maintain their own borders or can try to work on building or rebuilding after that. But how it's like the Sudan also case demonstrates how like non-state militia can now deploy advanced drone warfare, allowing irregular forces to strike civilians and military targets without conventional air forces, is also very important because the atrocity and genocide prevention department in the State Department, they asked me how to know the patterns in order to prevent next, for example, strikes and so on. Simply, it's how where population and civilians go and rescue refuge, and we can see this in markets being affected and in hospitals and in schools. It shows you that it's not anymore like a war between two parties. It's a war on civilians. And this is something that we also want to urge and to ask for accountability side of it. It's also for the external funders for this war because it's being funded and being sustained for this amount of time. And the accountability side for example, when we ask about how UAE is going to be sanctioned or conditioned on using their weapon, the US department very, very explicitly say they can't do that, for example. So as Mu'tasim say, when it comes to UAE side, it's just as if there is like the elephant in the room is not being addressed and so on. So this like repeated or like what's concerning is also how like the hostilities in the region and seeing of the intense clashes about that. It's for me it's hard to speak about peace process of while there is an ongoing things going like at the same time not to delegitimize the work of that, but it's just obscure to the mind, it's just can tells you like how funny the world works, because like there is ongoing things going on right now, and it's being funded, it's being sustained, and there is reports and there is now evidence. So I believe in the ICC side, although it takes time, but how also funding documentation is important and how researching this sides, because when we have information and legitimate data, then it will take long time, but at least it will make us believe in future peace buildings, let's say, peace agreements. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Inas. And I guess just to reiterate, these countries like the UAE and Saudi don't, uh, they've denied that their involvement in this conflict. They've not acknowledged their, support for either faction. They've not acknowledged that they are the ones sending weapons into these places, into Sudan. So I just wanted to highlight that. But Henny,
Yeah, I just want to mention that when we say like humanitarian aid is not about just giving this food to people who are in need right now or are starving. I have been watched people under siege for more than 500 days, and how my colleagues are sacrificing themselves to the level that we lost them. We don't know if they are alive or not because we don't have access right now. And one of the very things that you are just or everyone negotiated in the peace processes is the humanitarian aid safe corridors. So I think this is one of the first. But of course, the humanitarian aid is not just can solve. We can give people humanitarian aid for a life. Is this the solution? This is not the solution. The solution must came from Sudanese themselves. I'm sorry, but going to the speak to the Saudi or the UAE or Department of State, in respect for all of these external actors, will not give you or will not give us as Sudanese people any kind of solid solution. We need to come together, sit on a one table, and then put our everyone put his requirements, their conditions, and then we can move forward. We can sit for a year, for 2 years, for 30 years, but at the end of the day, um, we not uh, came. We will came with a solution that Sudani, and it's everyone can agree on that. Like what we are doing in the emergency response room right now, despite the all fragmentation, despite the all ethnicities, everything, we came together, we sit together. It's not a pink inside. We just move on, and we have the ability of the commitment to move on the problem and then work together. And so this community fabric is being destroyed by war. So this movement is not about just delivering the humanitarian aid, but it's built how to build the future of Sudan, since we are the youth who are going to prepare ourselves for the day after.
Thank you. I really do appreciate these responses. I do want to just say a couple of things before we go to the next question. It is we're coming up to 2:45, so I just want to make sure that our panelists have time to answer questions. So we might have to rush the next couple of questions just to give our attendees a little bit of time in case they had a couple of questions. But for our next question, I wanted to delve a little bit more into the gender dynamics. I know that that's also been brought up in your answers to the last question and your opening statements. And as you mentioned, women and children who are often sidelined, they do play a very crucial role in any conflict, and Sudan is no exception in this case. How has this ongoing conflict in Sudan specifically impacted the traditional roles and socioeconomic status of women? And what are the long-term effects of this war on the psychological, the physical, the educational development of children? And I did want to ask
Yeah, I'm
one
gonna
more
jump
question.
here.
Oh, sorry, Hanin, go for it,
Sorry.
and then I'll add my second question.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, I want to jump here. That as I mentioned this earlier, I said like this from gender. As I have gender master in peace and conflict. I mentioned that from gender lens, how this war affected the role of the Sudanese woman from caregiver to the first responders, how women they stood up to solve this problem, and how also they stood up in other part of the conflict. They carry weapon. So this war it transitions the role of the gender from the normal role of the caregiver and reproductive role to other kind of roles that we don't expect it. Some of them have good influence and others have bad influence. Also, we have a lost generation right now from 7 to 70. We are lost it with in education, in kind of social trauma that we are trying to heal with safe spaces and kind of trauma healing sessions that we are provided, but we don't have that enough fund and capacity to do that for the whole Sudanese are facing. And I have been watched women in refugees in across Chad and in Cairo and Chad and Egypt and Kampala. They are facing this trauma, carrying it from even previous before the war started. And also I can say like those children are outside the school right now, not only inside Sudan but also outside Sudan for the lack of the financial ability, lack of the security, because some of the countries does not provide a legal residency for those people who don't, so they don't have the ability to bring their children to the schools. And I think this is a big problem that international community must rely on and must stop on this kind of point, but no one actually paid attention.
Thank you so much. Ines, Mutassim, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Sorry, Motasem, if you want to go. All right. So, not to repeat what Hanin said, but it's really like uh, important also to emphasize the side of the funding and how also like the huge cut of US aid and also Sudan is also competing with attention. I also realized that when it came to CSW is that it's not just competing for fund, but also there is a huge geopolitical distraction and things going on in the region. So Sudan is not just being forgotten again, but it's not prioritized, let's say. So with the gender side of that is the state, when the structure of the states collapse, like women are increasingly becoming the primary providers. So they're responsible of securing the food and income and care, and they're extremely constrained and dangerous conditions. So this all combined with another intersection side, which is the sexual violence as a defined feature of this war, is really worrying because it's characterized how it carries a lot of meaning and it mirrors a lot of peacetime realities and what the war tried to intensify or carry. So the conflict is unfortunately very accurate how it's been fought on women big amount. And what we are waiting is not like the violence or what we're seeing it, but is also the systematic and the systematic pressure on that. So why it is all prevalent and why it's supposed to be documented in a very huge amount? Because several factors contribute to this extreme side. Because collapse of state institutions, absence of law enforcement, and total lack of accountability will again exclude or not prioritize sexual violence and the number of rapes that we're seeing. It won't be prioritized in peace agreements and it won't be put into consideration as a lot of peace agreements that in the past happened because it's supposed to be talked about later on. It's not a priority right now. So sexual violence in Sudan is not accident and it's not something that just happened or erupted. It's instrumental, it's used as a tool, and without accountability it risks also becoming normalized as a method of warfare in different regions in Sudan. Over to you, Matasim, if you want to mention.
Yeah, I mean, not much to add. I know Hannah's already you have additional question to add, but I guess there were two questions in the chat box, and can quickly take on that if that's okay, Hannah.
I was gonna get to them at the end.
Okay. Then I'll take it
I would
over.
say Sarah's
Turn it over.
question was related to the one I was gonna ask. So how about you answer this one? We'll get to the last question and then we'll get to the Q&A because I think they are quite good questions.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Okay. You want me to answer Sarah's question?
yeah. No,
Okay.
sorry. If you're okay with moving on to the next question, or if you wanted to add something to this question about gender dynamics.
No, I think I suffice with the answers already been
Sounds
provided.
good. Okay, and so I guess I know that we're running out of time, but the last question I really wanted to focus on was the peace process. Like I mentioned, I did want to end on a little bit of a more hopeful note. But you know, in your experiences and you know what you think, what political or diplomatic and humanitarian measures, what is still required to transition from this current protracted violence to a more sustainable ceasefire, and you know, start Sudan's journey towards a sustainable peace, towards sustainable peace and recovery.
Now that's a billion-dollar question. As Sudanese and Sudan, has been in this, pursuit of lasting peace and stability for quite some time. And I think this is one thing that I don't think the international community can help with if we speak about peace, right? We have tried this several times. We've tried this in 1972. We've tried this in 2005, 1997. We've tried this in 2005. We've tried this in 2006 and 11 and, 20 and bunch of, sort of agreements that, and we're yet in the process of pursuing lasting peace. The main reason is that most of these agreements were sort of, transactional between the dominant elites, whether political or military actors, right, dominating the political scene, and therefore they basically protect their interests. The power sharing agreements and wealth sharing agreements, including the vast majority of the Sudanese, and therefore those agreements have always been bilateral, transactional, and led to transitional, sort of, never led us to a sustainable peace. They have been more of transitional processes. Moving forward, and I think there is still an opportunity, and I guess this conflict can also serve as an opportunity to move to a lasting peace. I suppose now, with the pervasive atrocities and the culture of impunity, the key for the international community is to focus on ending the atrocities rather than focusing on the peace process, because the peace process really requires the participation of the Sudanese people, not only the warring parties, the broader Sudanese people. The idea is not to end up in a situation where you have, a process dominated by the powerful actors, whether political or military. And I think we should prioritize, and the international community should prioritize, and this will tap a little bit more into the question of Pauline, and maybe we can answer that more, extensively, is that there needs to be a focus on cessation of hostilities. And I guess because of the reluctance of the warring parties to enter into serious agreements, because they both think that they can win the conflict, I think perhaps a novel idea is to focus on localized ceasefires where you can arrest the ongoing atrocities as we continue to think of other ways to have a nationwide ending of hostilities. So I think the Quad, the Quintet, and all other groups and forums should focus solely on ending the atrocities, holding the perpetrators accountable and their enablers. That will pave a way for the Sudanese people to, be ready for a comprehensive peace process that will not protect the warlords.
I appreciate it. I think that was a really good answer to that question. I did want to get a chance to bring up some of the questions that were asked by the attendees. So if it's okay with our panelists, I'll go ahead and just see how many we can get done. So our first question is from Sarah. She asked, how do you think Western powers such as the US play a stronger role in addressing both the humanitarian crisis and the political conflict driving it? I guess that's for whoever wants to go and answer.
Okay. Yeah, I can go on and then give chance to my colleagues. But ultimately addressing the crisis in Sudan requires both political will as well and sustainable engagement. And we know that while the US Congress has a key role to play in shaping policy and allocating resources, civil society also remain essential, very essential. This is also a tackle the third question in a little bit without details, but in ensuring that these efforts are consistent, let's say, and going in a not as a reactive side, but more as a consistent side, and it's inclusive and responsive to the realities on the ground, because we suddenly live in a world that I know that I'm very sure that things can stop with a phone call, with a power dynamics things, but how important is to tackle the roots causes of the things is the inclusion of the civil society. But the key priorities for the US Congress include also stronger diplomatic engagement and civilian protection and accountability. the most important is accountability through sanctions and legal mechanisms. Because also when I was talking about the sanction side, I got asked in the US Department about names of people similar to Abu Lu'lu' in the ground. And it's not important about people Abu Lu'lu' or other people because the big fish was in Washington, D.C. without any accountability or sanctions. So there is people that appeared in those videos on TikTok or and so on, but they are underage. So it's like it's not important what those people in the videos as much as who enabled them is the important side of that. Because also, and again, sustained humanitarian support from the US Congress is also important, an inclusive peace process. And at the same time, civil society, again, plays a crucial role in maintaining pressure. We need to pressure what peace we want and what can be how we want to define its factors, because shaping policy agendas, we can work on that and ensuring that response are grounded in local realities and not just upside down, up to down implementation. And also, without this combined efforts between the US Congress and the civil society organization, this engagement will risk being reactive rather than being transformative, let's say. So, yeah.
Yes, I also may add that how the US addressing the humanitarian crisis in Sudan. I can say that the US has been addressing the humanitarian crisis through the Samantha Power in the USA previously addressed committed $30 million. $2 million of it went to the capacity building for the local responder. It was the first localized fund during the US aid, the whole US aid cycle. Also, like other governments, they give a recognition to the grassroots movement like Emergency Response Room and other regional aid groups that we are being nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for the third year this year. And last year we beat Mr. President. So I think this is kind of how to addressing the humanitarian crisis, not only by just funding and advocating and recognition, but also by encouraging this kind of the local solutions from the local responders in the way that can lead to get people out of this awful situation. Yeah.
Thank you so much for those answers. We do have a couple of minutes. Mujassim, do you have any lingering thoughts that you'd like to add before we close up?
I actually want to answer Ron's question, which
Go
I
for
think
it.
is really essential. I'll try to do this quickly. And thanks, Ron, for this excellent question. I mean, Ron's asking about whether there are ongoing, sort of universal jurisdiction cases. I'm not aware of any active cases at this point in time, but I know there are efforts by some of the civil society groups that are trying to push for universal jurisdiction, which I think is a crucial tool. I mean, combined with other accountability measures, right, to respond to the atrocities. Of course, there are two cases that he mentioned in his comment. One is the French bank, the Paribas, PMB Paribas. This is like a French bank that sort of pled guilty for violating U.S. sanctions, and and now Sudanese in America sued the company, and I think it's like this is one of the ways that we think we can respond to the malign involvement of corporate entities, right? The French bank case is really a powerful case that can actually remedy the victims of human rights abuse, not just sort of saying the company, hey, you did something wrong, but actually forcing the company to pay financial, to pay money for the victims. And then there's like a similar case in Sweden. It's like a London case, which is like another big case where two executives of this company, former executives now, have been indicted for human rights violations. And so the idea here is because of the mass atrocities and many actors involved, we have individuals, Sudanese individuals involved in atrocities. We have corporate entities involved in the atrocities. We have states. And so it's like a whole network. And so we have to target all of them. I mean, we know accountability always moves at the glacier pace, but in the end, it bends towards justice. And so I think we have to keep pushing and attack from more angles and to make sure that nobody evades justice.
You did a really good job of getting that done before 3. So I do appreciate it. And unfortunately, we do have to bring this webinar to an end. But I do want to thank all of our attendees for taking the time to, to bring your questions, to listen to our wonderful panelists who I think have done a phenomenal job discussing. I mean, the big thing was, civil society inclusion and accountability. So hopefully, not next week, but the week after, when we have our Sudan Advocacy Week, these are things that we can bring up during our meetings, and we can follow up with our attendees with more information on that. But with that, thank you so much to our panelists. This was a fantastic webinar, and I hope that this was a really good session where people learned a little bit more about what was happening in Sudan and how they can get a little bit more involved.
Thank you
So
very
thank
much,
you.
Hannah,
Thank
for
you,
excellent moderation. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Take care. Bye-bye.